The look on Karen's face when I told her she was trespassing on my private lake was worth every penny of the legal fees that followed. Picture this. I'm standing on my dock, pointing at fresh no trespassing signs while HOA President Brenda Hutchinson turns ghost white. Her pontoon boat motor sputters to silence. The smell of lake water and sunscreen hangs heavy in the July air. 20 neighbors watch from the shore as Brenda realizes she's been harassing the actual landowner for months. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just about lake access. Brenda had been planning to hit our community with $2.3 million in assessments using fake, shared waterfront rights. She thought she'd found the perfect mark when I inherited this property. Boy, was she wrong. What would you do if your HOA tried to steal your private property right in front of your guests? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I bet your HOA has tried something just as outrageous. Let me back up and tell you how I accidentally became the target of the most elaborate property scam I've ever seen. My name's Marcus Thornfield, and 6 months ago I was living a completely different life in Phoenix, recently divorced, burned out from my civil engineering job, and honestly questioning every life choice I'd made since college. Then I got the call that changed everything. My grandfather Ezra had passed away, leaving me his entire lakefront estate in Millbrook, Wisconsin. Now, Grandpa Ezra wasn't just any property owner. This man was basically the unofficial mayor of Crystal Lake. He owned 847 acres, including 2.3 miles of pristine shoreline, and for 60 years he'd been the town's beloved lake guardian. Free fish fries every summer, kids learning to swim in his cove, neighbors borrowing boats without asking. Grandpa treated that lake like a community resource. I spent every childhood summer here, learning about water rights while dock planks creaked under my feet and the scent of pine needles mixed with whatever fish Uncle Jim was cleaning at the dock. The property was incredible. Main house, guest cabins, boat launch, even the crumbling foundation of an 1890s mill that Grandpa always promised to restore next summer. That's when I met Brenda Hutchinson. And folks, this woman was a piece of work. Picture this. 52 years old, self-appointed Millbrook Shores Community Standards Director, a title that sounds official until you realize she made it up herself. She'd moved from Minneapolis suburbs 3 years earlier on a mission to elevate community standards, which apparently meant micromanaging everyone's mailbox height and deck stain color. Always in tennis whites despite never holding a racket, driving a white BMW SUV with Community First vanity plates, she had that special energy of someone who'd discovered the intoxicating power of HOA authority. She showed up exactly 1 week after I arrived, clipboard in hand, and that shark smile that screamed, "I'm about to ruin your day." "We need to discuss your grandfather's informal arrangements with the community," she announced, standing in my doorway like she owned the place. The sound of papers rustling mixed with her perfume, the kind that costs $200 an ounce and smells like it's trying to cover up something rotten. Here's where it gets good. Brenda whips out this 47-page community lake usage agreement requiring a $12,000 annual maintenance fee. She claimed lake access had been an implied easement that needed proper documentation, now that ownership transferred to an outsider. The way she said outsider made it clear she'd already decided I was the enemy. "Your grandfather was very cooperative with community needs," she purred. "I'm sure you'll want to continue that tradition." I politely declined, mentioning I was still reviewing Grandpa's documents. Her smile could have frozen the lake in July. The following weekend, I hosted a barbecue for 8 college friends, my first attempt at recreating those legendary gatherings Grandpa used to throw. We're having a blast until 2 p.m. when Hurricane Brenda storms onto my dock with laminated violation notices. "Sir, this community has standards," she declared, demanding a guest list like she was running Border Patrol. "Your grandfather understood appropriate boundaries." The smell of grilling burgers couldn't mask the awkward tension as my friends started packing up. Party over, thanks to the self-appointed Lake Police. That evening, feeling like I'd somehow failed Grandpa's memory, I decided to explore his study more thoroughly. Behind a bookshelf, I found a hidden panel, because apparently my grandfather was part librarian, part secret agent. Inside a cedar chest were original land deeds, surveyor maps, and water rights documentation dating back to the 1920s. One document made me grin like an idiot. Crystal Lake Water Rights Grant 1923. Signed, notarized, filed with the county, granting my family exclusive ownership of the entire lake. You know what I learned from my engineering background? When someone makes claims about your property rights, the county courthouse records don't lie. Everything else is just hot air and wishful thinking. Brenda had been running a protection racket on property she didn't own, couldn't control, and had zero legal authority over. I realized I wasn't dealing with an overzealous neighbor. I was dealing with a con artist, and she'd just picked the wrong mark. Monday morning hit me like a slap in the face, literally. I walked out to my truck and found an official-looking cease and desist letter shoved under my windshield wiper, the edges flapping in the morning breeze like a surrender flag. Except I wasn't the one surrendering. The document looked impressive at first glance, all fancy letterhead and legal-sounding language claiming the Millbrook Shores Homeowners Association had exclusive recreational rights to my waterfront. It threatened $500 daily fines for unauthorized lake usage and was signed by something called Community Legal Services. The smell of fresh ink and desperation was practically wafting off the paper. Here's the thing, though, and this is where my engineering training kicked in. I spent 10 minutes examining that letterhead and realized it was faker than Brenda's community authority. No legitimate law firm uses a P.O. box as their only address, and Community Legal Services sounded about as official as definitely not a scam incorporated. But Brenda's little power play got me curious about what story she'd been selling the neighbors, so I decided to do some detective work. First stop, Mrs. Dorothy Kowalski, 78 years old and sharp as a tack, who'd lived next door since the Carter administration. Brenda showed up like a tornado. Dorothy told me over coffee that tasted strong enough to strip paint. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon rolls and righteous indignation. Your grandpa never charged nobody nothing for 60 years. Then suddenly this woman appears talking about proper management and community standards. Next, I visited Jim Brennan, a retired teacher who lived 3 houses down. Jim dropped the real bombshell. Brenda had been collecting $200 monthly lake fees from 23 families for over 2 years. That's nearly $5,000 a month, folks, for doing absolutely nothing except printing fake invoices. The Hendersons, a young family who'd moved here for affordable lakefront living, were now paying $2,400 yearly to Brenda for the privilege of using what they thought was community property. Their kids were asking why they had to pay to swim when old Mr. Thornfield never charged anyone. Time for a trip to the county courthouse, where I spent the evening with clerk Sandra, a woman who knew property records like I knew engineering specs. The musty smell of old record books mixed with the mechanical churning of the copy machine as we dug into the truth. Discovery number 1. No HOA had ever been legally filed for Millbrook Shores. Zero paperwork, no registration, no legal standing whatsoever. Discovery number 2. Brenda's house deed showed a standard residential lot with exactly 0 water rights. She owned her driveway and backyard, period. Discovery number 3. Grandpa's 1963 property survey clearly showed private ownership of the entire lake, right down to the water line. I was feeling pretty good about my research when Thursday arrived with a knock on my door. Sheriff's Deputy Carson stood there looking uncomfortable, hat in hand. "Sir, I've got a complaint filed against you for harassment and property destruction," he said, consulting his notepad. "Lady claims you vandalized the community bulletin board and threatened residents." I had to laugh. "Deputy, the only thing I've destroyed is Brenda's fantasy about owning my lake. Want to see the actual property deeds?" His eyebrows shot up as I spread the courthouse documents across my kitchen table. The look on his face was priceless, like watching someone realize they'd been trying to arrest the homeowner for trespassing in their own house. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "She never mentioned you actually owned the lake." We drove over to Brenda's house together, where she was watering her petunias in full tennis regalia, confident smirk plastered across her face. That smirk started melting faster than ice cream in August when Deputy Carson began explaining property law basics. "Ma'am, seems like there might be some confusion about who owns what around here," he said diplomatically. "There must be some mistake," Brenda stammered, the water hose hitting concrete with sharp splashes. The smell of fertilizer and fresh mulch couldn't mask her growing panic. "The community has always shared lake access." "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Hutchinson," I said, keeping my voice pleasant and reasonable. "My family has shared it freely for generations. But collecting fees for property you don't own? That's not sharing, that's theft." Word traveled through Millbrook faster than gossip at a church potluck. 3 families stopped paying Brenda's lake fees immediately. The hardware store owner started mentioning the property dispute to every customer. Jim Brennan offered to help me research HOA formation laws, bless his heart. But Brenda wasn't done. Friday evening brought another final notice taped to my door, this time claiming Grandpa had signed some mystical verbal agreement witnessed by community elders. She threatened to file a lawsuit for breach of community covenant, which was impressive, considering no covenant existed. That's when I realized gentle correction wasn't going to work. Brenda was doubling down on crazy, and I needed to be ready for whatever came next. Tuesday morning brought a new level of audacity that honestly impressed me. I found a colorful flyer in my mailbox advertising a community meeting for Thursday at 7 p.m. Topic: waterfront access rights and safety concerns. The flyer listed Brenda as Millbrook Shores HOA president, with credentials that would make a used car salesman blush. Here's the kicker: 34 households received invitations, but somehow mine got lost in the mail. Funny how that works. Dorothy called me that afternoon, and I could practically hear her rolling her eyes through the phone. That woman's been going door to door with some cock and bull story about you planning to fence off the entire shoreline, she said. Claims you're from out of state and don't understand local customs. Jim Brennan reported even juicier gossip. Brenda was telling newer residents I planned to charge admission fees and ban children from swimming. The Henderson family actually approached me at the grocery store, their 8-year-old daughter clutching my sleeve with tears in her eyes. "Are you really going to keep us from swimming, Mr. Marcus?" she asked, and my heart just about broke. This was psychological warfare, and Brenda was using kids as ammunition. Time for some intelligence gathering of my own. I visited Millbrook Township office to research community meeting permits. The clerk, a no-nonsense woman who'd probably seen every scam in the book, shook her head when I described Brenda's activities. No permit filed, no legal HOA registration, no insurance coverage, she confirmed. If she's collecting money and holding official meetings, someone should report this to the state attorney general. The smell of bureaucratic coffee and photocopier toner filled the air as she handed me copies of property records for surrounding lots. Plot twist: 3 other families actually owned their own shoreline sections too. Brenda had been scamming people who didn't even need her permission to access the water. Thursday evening arrived, and I decided to crash Brenda's little propaganda session. The community center was packed. 40-plus residents squeezed into folding chairs, coffee and donuts on card tables, and Brenda standing at the front with a PowerPoint presentation like she was running a corporate board meeting. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while the smell of burnt coffee mixed with nervous energy. Brenda clicked through slides showing overcrowded lake conditions, which were just photos from my barbecue, and warned about liability issues and property value decline. Without professional management, she declared, we're one accident away from lawsuits that could bankrupt this entire community. I waited until she finished her 20-minute fear-mongering presentation before standing up during the Q&A session. "Mrs. Hutchinson, fascinating presentation," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Could you explain which legal authority granted you lake management rights?" You could hear a pin drop. Brenda's face went through more color changes than a mood ring. "Well, your grandfather's verbal agreements and community traditions," she stammered. That's when I pulled out my folder of courthouse records and started passing copies to the front row. The rustling of papers sounded like autumn leaves as people examined the evidence. "These are the original 1923 water rights grants," I announced. "They cover the entire lake. 3 other families here also own their shoreline sections. None of us granted anyone management authority." The murmurs started low and built like distant thunder. Several residents were checking their own property deeds on their phones, probably for the first time in years. Brenda tried to pivot, claiming my documents were outdated and that modern community standards override historical property rights. Then she made her fatal mistake, mentioning she'd already deposited $8,200 in the community lake maintenance account. "So you've been collecting money for services on property you don't own or control?" I asked sweetly. That's when the dam burst. The Henderson family stood up. "Wait, we've been paying for what exactly?" Jim Brennan. "Brenda, you told us this was legally required." Dorothy's voice cut through the chaos. "Ezra Thornfield never charged nobody a penny in 60 years. Brenda grabbed her laptop and made a hasty exit, shouting something about legal counsel being in touch. The community center erupted in confused conversations as 12 families approached me asking about refunds. Sarah Chen, who owns the local restaurant, offered to organize a real community discussion about lake access, one based on actual facts instead of fantasy. 3 residents mentioned that Brenda had been taking photos of their properties for insurance purposes, which sounded about as legitimate as her HOA presidency. But here's where things got really interesting. The next morning, I found surveyor stakes around my property with pending development ribbons fluttering in the breeze like surrender flags. A quick call to the county planning office revealed someone had filed a preliminary inquiry about subdividing my lakefront for a community recreational facility. Brenda wasn't just stealing fees anymore. She was planning to force the sale of my land through some kind of development scheme. The woman had gone from petty scam artist to full-blown property pirate. And honestly, I was almost impressed by her ambition. Almost. Certified mail arrived Friday morning like a legal bomb wrapped in official packaging. The return address read, North Shore Development Consultants, which sounded about as legitimate as Brenda's HOA credentials, and contained a preliminary assessment notice that made my coffee taste like battery acid. The letter claimed my lake property was under review for community enhancement project and suggested I might benefit from partnering with local stakeholders rather than fighting inevitable development. The return address matched that same P.O. box from Brenda's fake legal letters because apparently she thought changing letterheads would fool someone with an engineering degree. Time for another trip to the county planning office, where I discovered Brenda had submitted an application for community lake access improvement, with herself listed as the official community representative. The plans were breathtaking in their audacity. Boat launch expansion, a 40-car parking lot, and seasonal rental cabins scattered across my shoreline like she was planning a summer resort. The real kicker? The application claimed full community support with over 40 resident signatures attached. I recognized several names from Grandpa's old fishing tournament records, so I started making house calls. Dorothy's reaction was priceless. She never asked me to sign nothing about development. I signed a petition about speedboat safety because some idiot nearly ran over the Kowalski's dog. Jim Brennan was equally confused. She said it was for better lighting around the boat ramp, nothing about buildings or parking lots. The pattern became clear. Brenda had collected signatures for various lake safety improvements, then submitted them as approval for her development fantasy. That's fraud, folks, and the kind that gets federal attention when it involves wetlands and waterways. Meanwhile, Brenda launched her media campaign. The local newspaper ran an article titled, Community Seeks Compromise on Lake Access Dispute, that painted me as some out-of-state villain blocking traditional community use. They quoted an anonymous longtime resident saying, some newcomers don't understand small-town values, and included a photo of my no trespassing signs next to children looking sadly at the water. The pressure campaign intensified with neighbors stopping by for friendly visits. Mrs. Patterson from down the road showed up wringing her hands. Brenda says you're planning to put up fences and charge admission fees like some kind of theme park. Young Tommy Kowalski, Dorothy's grandson, broke my heart asking if their family could earn lake privileges by doing yard work. The smell of his grandmother's fresh-baked cookies on his clothes made the conversation even more heartbreaking. But Brenda's masterpiece was telling residents that lawyers advised her I could legally block emergency boat access for drowning rescues. She was literally claiming I might let people die over property disputes. The woman had gone from petty scammer to full-blown sociopath. Sarah Chen mentioned a strange conversation where Brenda had asked about seasonal tourism opportunities and whether the restaurant could handle increased summer traffic. That got me digging, and I found Brenda had been researching community-managed recreational facilities online. Hidden in her car one day, I spotted a notebook with financial projections: $50 daily boat rentals, $25 swimming fees, $200 fishing licenses. She wasn't just planning to steal my property, she was planning to turn Crystal Lake into her personal cash cow. Time to call in professional help. I contacted attorney Rebecca Storm in Madison, a sharp woman who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. Her assessment was blunt. This is fraud with potential real estate conspiracy elements. Document everything, avoid direct confrontation, and let her dig herself deeper. Rebecca warned that if the development application proceeded, it could trigger an expensive legal battle, even though I'd eventually win. She's betting you'll cave rather than fight, she explained. Classic intimidation strategy. The community was splitting into factions. Dorothy's crew, longtime residents who remembered Grandpa's generosity, versus Brenda's followers convinced I was a greedy outsider. Then there were the fence-sitters who just wanted their kids to keep swimming without drama. Brenda escalated again by filing a complaint with the township about unsafe swimming conditions at my property. She claimed inadequate lighting, dangerous dock conditions, and no lifeguard supervision made the lake a public safety concern requiring community management. The sound of her heels clicking across the township office floor echoed like gunshots as she demanded official intervention. But I was learning something important about Brenda. She couldn't help herself. Every lie required bigger lies. Every scheme demanded more elaborate schemes. Jim suggested letting her keep digging and give her enough rope, while Dorothy's wisdom rang true. Your grandfather always said the truth comes out when folks get greedy enough. So I decided to set a trap. I started mentioning to various neighbors that I was considering compromise options and might be willing to formalize lake access agreements under certain conditions. Word got back to Brenda within hours, and I could practically see the dollar signs dancing in her eyes. She thought she was wearing me down. In reality, I was just getting started, and Brenda was about to discover that some fights you really don't want to pick. That weekend, I finally decided to tackle Grandpa's locked cedar chest properly. I'd been putting it off, partly from grief and partly because the old combination lock seemed impossible to crack. But sitting in his study, surrounded by the smell of old leather books and pipe tobacco that still lingered in the wood, I remembered something he used to say. Marcus, the most important secrets hide in plain sight. The combination wasn't some random numbers. It was my birthday, because of course it was. The old man had always been sentimental like that. Inside, beneath the property deeds I'd already found, lay a treasure trove that made my engineering brain practically purr with satisfaction. Correspondence with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources dating from 1998 to 2019, official documents with state seals, and then the bombshell that changed everything. Crystal Lake had been designated as a critical watershed protection zone in 1999, with my grandfather serving as the legal steward. But here's the kicker. The state had been paying him $47,000 annually for conservation management. For 20 years, I kept digging and found something even better. In 2015, Grandpa had established the Crystal Lake Environmental Trust with me as the automatic beneficiary upon his death. The trust contained $340,000 in accumulated conservation funds, plus ongoing annual payments for maintaining the ecosystem. My hands were literally shaking as I read through EPA classifications showing the lake supported endangered freshwater mussels and rare native trout species. Any construction within 500 feet of the shoreline required federal environmental impact studies. Brenda's development plans would violate 3 separate federal environmental protection laws, with automatic penalties of $50,000 per day for unauthorized development. But the most beautiful irony was buried in the trust documentation. As the legal steward, I was actually required to maintain public access for educational and recreational use. Brenda's demands for community access were already legally mandated, but without any fees, management companies, or fake HOA nonsense. I called Rebecca Storm immediately, even though it was Saturday evening. Your grandfather was brilliant, she said after I read her the trust provisions. This structure makes you legally untouchable. Brenda's development application will trigger automatic federal investigation when they discover she's planning to develop protected watershed. Rebecca explained that fee collection becomes wire fraud when combined with false development claims. She's not just running a local scam anymore, she's committed federal crimes. The strategic advantage was mind-blowing. Instead of just defending my property rights, I could now provide genuine community benefits using trust funds. Handicap-accessible docks, native species education programs, annual conservation festivals, everything Brenda had promised, but better, legal, and free. Let her proceed with the development application, Rebecca advised. Federal agencies will investigate and discover the fraud during environmental review. Meanwhile, you transform from selfish inheritor to environmental steward in the public eye. I spent Sunday night reading through Grandpa's detailed notes about his conservation plans. He'd sketched designs for wheelchair-accessible fishing piers, educational signage about local wildlife, even ideas for a summer program teaching kids about watershed protection. The old man had been thinking decades ahead, building legal protections that would outlast him. Monday morning, I had my strategy. I wouldn't just expose Brenda's scam. I'd replace her entire fake operation with something legitimate and beneficial. Let her dig herself deeper while I built something that actually served the community she claimed to represent. The irony was perfect. Brenda thought she was stealing lakefront property for profit. In reality, she was about to trigger a federal investigation of her own crimes while I used conservation money to provide everything she'd promised, but legally and ethically. Some days, I really missed that old man. But right then, sitting in his study with legal dynamite spread across his desk, I felt like he was still looking out for me. Tuesday evening found me hosting what I like to call my war council around Grandpa's old kitchen table. The smell of Dorothy's homemade snickerdoodles mixed with the evening light reflecting off the lake through the windows as I laid out my battle plan to the dream team. Dorothy, Jim Brennan, Sarah Chen, and attorney Rebecca Storm, who'd driven up from Madison with a briefcase full of legal ammunition. "Folks," Rebecca began, spreading documents across the table like a general planning D-Day, "we're not just stopping a scammer here. We're about to turn Marcus into the community hero while Brenda accidentally commits federal crimes." The strategy was beautiful in its simplicity, a three-pronged attack that would expose Brenda's fraud while positioning me as the legitimate community steward I'd inherited the responsibility to be. Prong one was environmental protection. Rebecca filed formal notification with the EPA about unauthorized development applications in protected watershed. "This automatically triggers federal investigation," she explained, the satisfaction evident in her voice. "When they discover Brenda's funding sources and signature fraud, it becomes a criminal matter." While the feds got involved, I announced free environmental education programs using the trust funds. The messaging was perfect. Following grandfather's conservation legacy while ensuring proper community access. Instead of fighting community demands, I was exceeding them legally. Prong two was systematic fraud documentation. Jim and Dorothy became my volunteer private investigators, interviewing neighbors about Brenda's signature collection methods. Wisconsin allows one-party consent recording, so they started documenting every conversation. Sarah Chen kept detailed notes about Brenda's discussions of profitable lake management schemes. Rebecca subpoenaed the community maintenance account bank records, which revealed a paper trail of electronic transfers that crossed state lines, turning local fraud into federal wire fraud charges. Prong three was providing the community alternative Brenda had promised but could never deliver. I announced a Crystal Lake Heritage Festival for July 4th weekend, completely free and funded by the Conservation Trust. Free boat rides, fishing lessons for kids, environmental education stations, historical displays about Grandpa's 60 years of stewardship. The visual contrast would be devastating. Professional community programming versus Brenda's amateur power grab. I spent the next week using trust funds for infrastructure improvements that put Brenda's promises to shame. Professional dock repairs, safety lighting that actually worked, life ring stations at proper intervals. The wheelchair-accessible fishing pier from Grandpa's sketches became reality, built to ADA specifications with help from my engineering background. Rebecca's paralegal set up a comprehensive documentation system. Every interaction with Brenda got recorded. Every communication went through the attorney's office to establish legal precedent. 3 neighbors agreed to witness any harassment or trespassing attempts. The psychological warfare was my favorite part. I started being aggressively friendly to Brenda in public, always waving, asking about her day, mentioning upcoming free community events. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Brenda? Perfect weather for the festival planning." The woman couldn't figure out why I wasn't intimidated anymore. Sarah Chen contacted the newspaper editor to correct their previous biased coverage. The news story angle: Inherited Conservation Trust provides free community lake programs. We arranged photos of me with local children at the new accessible fishing pier, plus expert quotes from EPA representatives confirming the environmental protection importance. I organized a property rights and community law information session at the library with Rebecca as guest speaker. She explained the difference between legitimate HOAs and fraud operations, providing handouts about verifying legal registration and understanding legitimate fees. Knowledge is power, and I was arming the community with facts. The bait was almost too easy. I accidentally mentioned to Brenda's remaining supporters that I was considering formalizing lake access agreements through proper legal channels. Word reached Brenda within hours, and I could see her thinking she might still salvage her scheme through negotiation. The federal response was swift and decisive. EPA investigators arrived within 48 hours of Rebecca's notification, sending official letters about investigation of unauthorized development in protected watershed. The development application was frozen immediately, with Brenda's plans under federal scrutiny. Even better, the EPA forwarded evidence of fee collection to the FBI Financial Crimes Unit for wire fraud investigation. What started as petty neighborhood drama had escalated to federal criminal charges. Community momentum was building beautifully. Word spread about the free festival and professional safety improvements. Even former Brenda supporters started questioning why they'd been paying fees for services that were now being provided legitimately at no cost. 15 families volunteered for festival organization, and local businesses got excited about the tourism potential of actual environmental programs rather than Brenda's fake development schemes. But my favorite moment came when I realized I'd learned something crucial about property inheritance that most people never discover. Environmental protections often include grant funding for improvements. I called the state environmental agency and discovered additional programs available for watershed conservation. The trap was set, the federal investigation was underway, and the community was rallying around legitimate programming. Brenda thought she was wearing me down through intimidation. She had no idea she was about to face the full weight of federal environmental law. Tuesday morning hit Brenda like a freight train carrying federal paperwork. The EPA investigation notice arrived at the township office, and according to the clerk who called me laughing, Brenda stormed in demanding to know who sabotaged the community development project. Her voice echoed through the building as she accused me of lying about environmental status to block legitimate community improvements. The clerk's response was priceless. "Ma'am, you can't develop protected watershed without federal permits. That's been law for decades." But Brenda wasn't going down without a fight. Wednesday night, I discovered my dock safety lights had been unplugged and the life ring station mysteriously relocated to someone's backyard. Thursday morning brought an even bolder escalation. Fake, private property, no swimming signs posted around my entire shoreline, complete with forged, by order of Millbrook Township footers. The sound of my hammer clanging against metal stakes echoed across the water as I removed the illegal signage. The smell of treated lumber and fresh hardware store tags told me these signs were expensive. Brenda was investing serious money in her harassment campaign. That's when her media blitz exploded across social media. The local Facebook group became a battlefield with Brenda posting photos and rants about the out-of-state millionaire blocking lake access. She claimed the EPA investigation was my attempt to weaponize environmental law against the community. Her photo manipulation skills were almost impressive. She'd cropped images of me removing her fake signs to make it look like I was destroying legitimate safety notices. The comment threads turned into 200 message wars between neighbors who'd never argued about anything stronger than snowplow schedules. But Brenda's smear campaign got personal fast. She started telling neighbors I planned to charge admission for lake access like a theme park, and claimed Grandpa was forced to sign environmental papers by government bureaucrats. Then she attacked my divorce, spreading rumors I was running from legal troubles in Arizona. 3 festival volunteers withdrew after hearing her stories, and I watched the community divide deepen. Dorothy and Jim started recording conversations whenever Brenda approached them, building our evidence file while protecting themselves from her increasingly desperate lies. Rebecca's paralegal documented every fake social media post, screenshot every defamatory comment. "She's building our harassment case for us," Rebecca noted with professional satisfaction. "Desperate people make stupid mistakes." Friday evening brought Brenda's most brazen move yet, a personal visit to my door with what she called a compromise proposal. I'd been expecting this, so my phone was recording when she launched into her pitch. "Look, we both know you can't fight the whole community forever," she said, fidgeting with her tennis bracelet. "Why not make some money instead of enemies?" Her offer was beautifully incriminating. I could keep the lakefront house, but the community would manage lake access for everyone's benefit. She offered me 30% of management fees in exchange for a property use agreement. "Think about it," she continued, not realizing she was confessing to attempted bribery on recording. 47 families paying $200 monthly, that's over $100,000 annually. Your cut would be $30,000 for doing absolutely nothing. I pretended to consider her offer while she dug herself deeper. "The development application is just leverage," she admitted. "Once you sign the management agreement, we withdraw those plans." 20 minutes of recorded confession later, Brenda left thinking she'd finally found my price. In reality, she'd just handed me evidence of conspiracy, attempted bribery, and admission that her development plans were fraudulent from the start. The federal investigation accelerated over the weekend. EPA investigators arrived for a site visit and discovered Brenda's unauthorized signage scattered around the property. Rebecca explained that forging government agency notices is a federal crime, separate from the environmental violations. Monday brought FBI financial crimes agents requesting records of Brenda's community account. Wire fraud charges were escalating because her electronic fee transfers crossed state lines, making it federal jurisdiction. The community was fracturing under the pressure. Anonymous flyers appeared claiming I'd hired federal agents to intimidate neighbors, which was both hilarious and tragic. Dorothy organized a Support Marcus response with a factual timeline of events, while local businesses started choosing sides based on economic interests. The saddest part was watching kids ask their parents why they couldn't swim at the lake anymore because of Brenda's fake signs. That's when I knew the gloves were coming off completely. Saturday morning, I discovered the new accessible fishing pier had been vandalized. Handrails bent, decking boards pried loose, chains wrapped around the boat launch dock to prevent access. The sheriff's deputy who filed the vandalism report shook his head in disgust. "Ma'am's really lost it now." I installed trail cameras around the property perimeter, and they immediately paid off. Sunday evening footage showed Brenda herself removing one of my cameras from a tree, apparently not realizing the other cameras were watching her destroy evidence in a federal investigation. Obstruction of justice is a felony, folks. Brenda had just escalated from local scammer to federal criminal, and she'd done it all on camera. Monday morning delivered Brenda's nuclear option, a certified letter from the Millbrook Community Legal Defense Fund that was so audacious I actually laughed out loud. She was threatening to sue me for exclusionary practices that allegedly violated civil rights and community standards. The letterhead looked like it came from a discount print shop, complete with stock photo scales of justice. But here's where it gets interesting. She was soliciting $500 donations from neighbors for legal action against the property monopolist. That's me, apparently. The letter was signed by a community legal advocate who, according to Rebecca's quick bar association search, had about as much legal standing as my neighbor's golden retriever. Meanwhile, the FBI Financial Crimes Unit was having a field day with Brenda's banking records. They'd discovered $14,700 in her main community account from 47 families, plus a secret second account labeled Lake Development Reserve Fund containing another $8,200. Wire fraud evidence was piling up like snow in a Wisconsin winter, with electronic transfers from residents in 3 different states. Snowbirds paying remotely for services that didn't exist. Rebecca filed a comprehensive civil suit against Brenda while the federal investigation continued. "We're not just seeking damages," she explained. "This includes class action elements to recover stolen fees for every resident she defrauded." The environmental angle added serious weight. Threatening protected watershed areas brings federal prosecutors running. My trail cameras were working overtime, and they captured something beautiful. Brenda and an unknown man surveying my property boundaries at midnight like discount cat burglars. A quick background check revealed the man was an unlicensed development consultant with a history of land fraud schemes across 3 states. The bigger picture was becoming clear. Brenda wasn't just a local scammer. She was part of an organized effort targeting vulnerable inherited properties, specifically looking for elderly property owners and their heirs who might not understand their legal rights. Brenda organized an emergency community meeting at her house Tuesday evening, complete with an agenda to formally petition township for eminent domain action. The intimidation tactics were getting desperate. She suggested families who didn't support the action might lose all lake access permanently, and warned that legal costs would be split only among committed community members. Rebecca contacted the township attorney proactively, informing them about the unauthorized meetings and fake legal threats. The township's response was swift and decisive, an official notice clarifying that no HOA was registered, no eminent domain action was planned, and residents should be aware that participating in fraudulent fee collection could expose them to legal liability. The surveillance footage kept delivering evidence like Christmas presents. My cameras revealed Brenda had been accessing other neighbors' properties without permission, photographing and measuring multiple shoreline lots. She wasn't just targeting my inheritance, she was casing the entire neighborhood for similar schemes. The FBI requested all surveillance footage for their broader investigation into what they now suspected was an interstate fraud operation. Brenda had gone from small-town scammer to federal fugitive without even realizing it. The regional newspaper picked up the story with devastating coverage. Local woman accused of lake access fraud. The article included photos of her fake signs, forged documents, and unauthorized development plans. Community reaction was swift. 3 families immediately demanded refunds of their community fees, and several others started asking uncomfortable questions about where their money had actually gone. Wednesday evening brought Brenda's psychological breakdown to my doorstep. She appeared obviously distressed, her usual tennis outfit wrinkled, and her perfect hair disheveled. The smell of desperation was practically radiating off her as she launched into a rambling confession. "I got in over my head," she admitted, tears mixing with mascara. "I really wanted to help the community, but everything spiraled out of control." Then came the blame shifting. "You're destroying neighborhood unity. These are innocent families who trusted me." But her final threat chilled me to the bone. "Some people are really angry about this federal investigation. I can't guarantee your safety if you keep pushing." That was it. I called Sheriff's Department immediately, and Rebecca filed for a restraining order the next morning. The sheriff increased patrols around my property and briefed his deputies about the ongoing federal investigation. They scheduled security presence for the July 4th festival, treating Brenda's threat as credible. The beautiful irony was watching her alliance crumble in real time. Even her strongest supporters began distancing themselves as the legal exposure became clear. Families who'd paid development fees realized their money might never be recovered, and former inner circle members started avoiding her calls to protect themselves from legal implications. But the sweetest moment came when families started approaching me to apologize and ask about festival participation. The community was healing itself, choosing legitimate programming over Brenda's fraudulent schemes. I announced the festival would proceed as planned despite recent community tensions, emphasizing positive community building and environmental education. Professional event management, law enforcement presence, and regional media coverage were all arranged. The final bait was mentioning the festival would include a presentation about the lake's legal history and community rights. Brenda thought she was facing a simple property dispute. She had no idea she was about to be exposed in front of federal agents, regional media, and 200 community members who'd finally learned the truth. July 4th dawned perfect. Crystal blue skies reflecting off the lake like a postcard, with the smell of grilling burgers already drifting across the water by 10 a.m. Over 200 community members and visitors streamed onto the festival grounds, kids shrieking with delight as they splashed in the swimming area while parents marveled at the professional setup I'd arranged with conservation trust funds. Colorful tents and banners fluttered in the breeze, volunteer stations hummed with activity, and 3 news crews positioned themselves strategically around the main pavilion. The high school jazz band provided soundtrack while food trucks lined the access road, generating an estimated $15,000 in local business revenue. This was what legitimate community programming looked like. Historical displays showcased Grandpa's 60 years of conservation work, complete with wildlife photography and interactive stations where kids could learn about endangered freshwater mussels. The new wheelchair-accessible fishing pier was packed with families, and the professional liability insurance I'd purchased meant everyone could relax and enjoy themselves without worry. At 2:30 p.m., right on schedule, Brenda made her entrance. She marched across the festival grounds like a woman possessed, clipboard clutched in one hand, and 3 remaining supporters trailing behind her like confused ducklings. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as she beelined toward my information tent, her white tennis outfit practically glowing with righteous fury. "This illegal gathering needs to end immediately," she announced loud enough for half the festival to hear. The smell of sunscreen and lake water couldn't mask the tension that suddenly crackled through the air. I was ready for her. "Mrs. Hutchinson, so glad you could make it to our community celebration. Beautiful day, isn't it?" But Brenda wasn't here for pleasantries. She demanded I provide event permits and insurance documentation, then whipped out a laminated badge identifying her as a community safety inspector, apparently her latest invented credential. "As elected HOA president," she declared for the crowd's benefit, "I'm shutting down this unauthorized commercial activity." The murmur of confused voices rippled through the gathering families. Some started packing up, unsure what was happening. That's when I made my move. "I appreciate your concern for community safety," I said calmly, handing her a folder thick with official documents. "Here are all the permits filed with the township, comprehensive insurance coverage for all activities, and documentation from our professional safety coordinator." Brenda's face flushed as she rifled through legitimate paperwork that demolished her authority claims. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. "Could you show everyone your official credentials for inspecting community events?" I asked sweetly. That's when she made her fatal mistake, producing that fake HOA registration certificate with obvious forgeries and claiming authority she'd never possessed. The news cameras zoomed in on her laminated lies while phones appeared throughout the crowd, recording everything. I walked to the sound system and asked for the microphone. "Folks, Mrs. Hutchinson has raised important questions about legal authority here. I'd like to clarify exactly who has legal standing over Crystal Lake." The festival's large screen lit up with projected copies of property deeds, EPA designations, and Conservation Trust documentation. 200 people fell silent as I walked them through the 1923 water rights grant, Grandpa's surveys, and current legal ownership. The EPA official attending today's festival can confirm our federal watershed designation, I continued, gesturing to Agent Rodriguez, who nodded professionally. "Mrs. Hutchinson, I'd like to announce that this is all private property and you've been trespassing for months while collecting fees for services you had no authority to provide." The crowd's reaction was electric, nervous laughter mixed with gasps of understanding as people realized they'd been watching a con artist in action. Brenda's desperation became increasingly unhinged as she claimed I'd bought off federal agents and forged historical documents. But her self-incrimination was beautiful to witness. "I've been protecting this community's rights for 3 years, she shouted. "I collected over $23,000 in legitimate community fees for proper lake management." That's when Sheriff Deputy Martinez stepped forward with perfect timing. "Ma'am, FBI has a warrant for your arrest on federal fraud charges." The metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the suddenly silent festival grounds as charges were read. Wire fraud, mail fraud, forgery of government documents, obstruction of federal investigation. The smell of nervous sweat mixed with lake air as Brenda's remaining supporters backed away like she'd become radioactive. Regional news cameras captured every moment of the dramatic arrest during what was supposed to be a family-friendly community festival. Kids continued playing in the background, oblivious to the adult drama, perfectly symbolizing community resilience. But here's what I'm most proud of. Instead of gloating, I immediately redirected attention back to the celebration. Let's focus on what brought us together today, celebrating this beautiful lake and our amazing community. I announced the annual festival would continue indefinitely, funded by the Conservation Trust, and invited even Brenda's former supporters to participate in legitimate programming going forward. The hashtag #Crystal Lake Festival started trending regionally within hours, with overwhelmingly positive coverage of community spirit triumphing over fraud. Local businesses reported their best July 4th sales in years, and the story got picked up by fraud prevention websites nationwide. Sometimes justice isn't just about winning, it's about building something better than what came before. 1 week after Brenda's dramatic arrest, the dust had settled into something beautiful. She pleaded guilty to 3 felony fraud charges, agreeing to pay $47,000 in restitution to avoid a lengthy federal trial. The community restitution meeting I organized at the Township Hall was packed. Every defrauded family received full refunds, plus interest calculated from their first payment to Brenda's fraudulent scheme. Dorothy wiped away tears as she got her $4,800 back. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she told me, squeezing my hand with surprising strength. "You turned something ugly into something beautiful." The property restoration moved quickly once federal agents finished processing the crime scene. Trail damage was repaired, the fishing pier was completed with handrails that actually met safety codes, and the new security system meant everyone could enjoy the lake without worrying about midnight vandals. Rebecca's civil lawsuit settled for an additional $75,000, with Brenda agreeing to a permanent restraining order and public apology that was published in the regional newspaper. She lost her house to pay legal fees and restitution, her husband filed for divorce, and her adult children cut contact after the social media infamy went viral. But here's what really matters. I established the legitimate Crystal Lake Community Council with elected representatives from surrounding families. Monthly watershed protection workshops became so popular, we had waiting lists. Children's nature programs taught kids about endangered species, while they splashed in the same swimming holes I'd used 40 years earlier. The annual festival became a regional attraction, generating real economic development for local businesses. Sarah Chen's restaurant saw a 25% revenue increase during festival weekends, and the County Tourism Board featured our conservation success story in their official guide. Marcus, personally, I found something I'd been missing since the divorce: purpose. The township elected me to the board specifically to focus on environmental protection, and dating Sarah felt natural after months of working together on community programs. I decided to stay permanently, honoring Grandpa's stewardship legacy while building something new. The Conservation Trust expanded beyond my wildest dreams. University of Wisconsin established a field research station at the lake, studying our native trout population recovery, up 40% in the first year of professional management. Dead zones were cleared, invasive species removed, and native plants reestablished using scientific restoration methods. Wisconsin's Attorney General's office now uses our case to educate communities about HOA fraud prevention. The state legislature passed the Community Conservation Protection Act based on our experience, strengthening oversight of HOA formation and protecting inherited conservation properties from development pressure. Federal recognition came when Crystal Lake became a model for community-based watershed protection nationwide. Environmental Stewardship Success Stories featured us in a documentary that aired on PBS, and I've spoken at property rights seminars across 3 states. But my favorite outcome is watching the community heal itself. 30 families now participate in regular lake maintenance and conservation activities. Dorothy became our volunteer historian, documenting the lake's conservation legacy for future generations. The high school environmental club adopted water quality monitoring as their annual project, with students earning college scholarships through the Ezra Thornfield Environmental Scholarship I established. This year's festival attracted over 500 visitors, raising $12,000 for regional watershed protection programs. Local kids call it the best lake ever during summer swimming programs. And honestly, that's worth more than any legal victory. Looking forward, the Conservation Trust has funding to acquire additional threatened watershed properties. 3 neighboring counties approached me about expanding the conservation model, and we're facing new pressure from a casino resort company targeting adjacent lots. But that's a story for another time. As Grandpa always said, the lake doesn't belong to any one person. We're all just temporary stewards. Dorothy's wisdom proved prophetic. Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind folks what community really means. And Sarah's perspective became my guiding principle. The best revenge against fraud is building something honest and beautiful. The sweetest irony? Brenda thought she was stealing lakefront property for profit. Instead, she triggered federal protection that made the area more valuable and more protected than ever before. Her greed exposed a fraud network targeting rural communities, leading to prosecutions across 3 states. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about justice. Speaking of justice, drop a comment about the craziest thing your HOA has tried to pull. I bet you've got stories that would make Brenda look reasonable. And hit that subscribe button if you love seeing scammers get their comeuppance. Ring the bell for notifications when I drop the next community justice story. Remember, folks, the best defense against property fraud is knowledge. Know your rights, verify all claims, and never forget that legitimate community organizations operate transparently with proper legal registration.
That's a wrap for today's episode on HOA Stories. If you enjoyed watching Karma in action, smash that like button, comment your thoughts, and let us know if you've dealt with HOA madness too. Subscribe so you won't miss the next HOA meltdown we post.